Andrew, welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, it's awesome to be back, William.
Yeah. For our audience, we had our part one episode that was released a few weeks ago. We actually recorded the episode several weeks before that, but we've had such interest in the first episode. We were definitely interested in doing a part two to begin with, but definitely given the interest, we decided to let's dive even a little bit deeper into Anduril and the focus of the defense industry, especially in the US in the 21st.
Well, I mean, it's a big topic, so there's a lot to talk about, and I'm always glad to hear that people are interested in it. So let's do this.
Definitely. So I think last time we were talking really focused on like Anduril's innovations, Anduril's products, how it's really adding this both cost efficiency, kind of private sector innovation and impact to making its products, its softwares and hardwares even more affordable to the U.S. DoD components, but also even its allies. I want to take us a step back and focus a little bit on the defense industry as a whole. There's a really funny meme, and if I have time, I'll kind of crop that into this short clip, perhaps. But there was a meme of a photo on the Washington D.C. Metro. And it's just basically one of the primes advertising on like, you should upgrade this engine. And the meme was, this ad is exclusively targeted towards 4 procurement officers in the DC area specifically. Given that meme, we laugh, but it's also probably somewhat accurate. What is kind of the procurement and kind of the process for the DoD or like the larger defense industries as it relates to the primes and even now Anduril, which is a pretty big player on contracts there as well?
Yeah, I mean, we're getting big, but I will say, there's hopefully a lot of growth to go. When you look
Absolutely.
about like at the amount of revenue that General Dynamics or Northrop or whatever are bringing in. But yeah, so the procurement process. So what I think is like really interesting about defense procurement is that in some ways it is like far more transparent than a lot of commercial markets. So, the government publishes budget documents, they publish, doctrine and white papers. So there's a lot of, on one level, like clarity about the general direction that the DoD is headed. However, I think like the actual way that like the business gets done is way more opaque. So you have, you're talking about these like four, program officer people inside the Pentagon, like that is like the real market is there's like human beings
Yeah.
in DoD offices that are going to be evaluating proposals and making procurement decisions. So there's really this like lengthy process that the large players and the more established, it's not just large, but also the more established players go through where they have regular touch points with the program offices. If you're a prime, you might have personnel embedded in those program offices doing staff augmentation. So you're shaping the entire way that the humans that are ultimately going to award the contract are thinking about the problem. And so it's not so much that, it's like some corrupt system where somebody's being bribed or whatever. It's a little bit more subtle than that. It is, you're a large company, you have technology that you think is the right solution to the government's problem. You're going to spend 6 months or a year before an RFP drops talking to those program managers and hopefully persuading them that you have one of the leading solutions. And so when the request for proposal hits the street, the company will be like one of the two or three that
Right.
are top choice. And so kind of like thinking about this mechanically and from a financial perspective, if you're one of the two or three leading contenders, you've got a 33 to 50% chance of winning that contract. So then when you think about how much effort you're going to put into preparing that proposal, you have a much higher expected value than, some smaller company, some non-traditional that, I mean, it's kind of an open question, like who's got better technology or whatever, but like assuming, the technology is similarly compelling, you're just going to put in a much better proposal because it just makes a lot more sense for you to put in a better, more fully prepared proposal. So that part's kind of tough. And then there's the whole like RFP process where depending on how individual program offices structure it, it can be very lightweight and streamlined, like the AFWorks SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research Program, where it's like a pitch deck and it's a short white. I think it's like for the smaller awards, and don't quote me on this because it's been years since I've been involved in it, but it was like, a pitch deck and like a 5-page paper, which is about the shortest response, or a major defense program and it could be hundreds of pages.
Right.
And then I think so then you also get into like on the procurement side, some of the challenges, or if you might say like moats. There's like two ways, right? So if you're a new entrant, this is a challenge. If you're an established prime, this is a moat. There's a ton of compliance that goes on. So, if you're on a large cost plus contract, you have to have
exactly
a verified accounting system that meets all the DoD standards. So you can do this thing called earned value management, where you're able to say, this is like the exact amount of work that we did, so this is how much you should pay us.
Right.
There's CMMC, which is like a cybersecurity certification that'll be rolling out over the next several years. There's a lot of different security things. So either way, all this means that if you're a new entrant, there is a super steep learning curve to climb. There's a whole lot of sort of non-revenue generating investments you have to make just to play in the space.
Talent, connections. Yeah.
I mean, salespeople are always expensive. Good salespeople are always expensive. And, I think that's like a similar problem in defense. It is, it's interesting because defense is like the actual enterprise sales process is not so different, I think, than like doing enterprise sales outside of government. The issue is there's a lot of like binary outcome opportunities where, a customer might only buy one version of this thing for the next 10 years. So, you have to be ready to go for that one thing. And if you don't get it, then, that's a huge problem. And then at the risk of perpetuating this already lengthy answer, another kind of challenge with that like binary outcome thing is that it makes it really hard to justify investments, like private investments, independent research and development on the part of the primes in particular, because of the way their business model is structured. If you have, and then also the amount of value you can generate from a contract. So like, if there's going to be one competition for this kind of a thing, and it's going to be $1 billion award, and you have to, you can choose to put in, $100 million of your own money to develop the thing, and you have like a 50% chance of winning or a 25% chance of winning. And then for winning that contract, you're going to get to keep $100 million in profit. It makes it like, so then you start thinking, okay, there's a time value of money component there. There's like a risk adjusted return there. And then you start getting into like, well, how much money can I responsibly invest to try to capture this? And then suddenly the amount of like IRAD money that it, makes sense to put into that technology, $10 million or something.
Right. Drastically less.
So I'll pause there.
Yeah. And then you mentioned something really interesting, and this is all part of the incentives for developing new technologies and weapon systems. We had, I think watching in my research, like, in the 1950s and 60s, the US military was able to develop like 5 generations or 5 classes of like a certain type of bomber or fighter jet. And we, the most recent one, the latest is I believe, which has taken decades and over $1.7 trillion, I think, to develop in that time frame.
I've stopped paying attention. It's just a terribly big number.
Definitely, right? And why do you think that happens? And I know you mentioned a specific type of, I think, competitive or a contract. It's called a cost plus contract. Can you explain that at a broad level, perhaps for folks who are curious and, understand that that's a really big component of how the DoD sends out these bids?
Yeah. So a cost plus. So like, let's start kind of at a theoretical level about like, what are the advantages of cost plus contracts or firm fixed price contracts or some combination of those features. So it's really about like where the risk lies in the contract. So on a cost plus contract, the government carries all the risk. So, they are going to reimburse all of your allowable expenses, and then they're going to pay you some profit margin on top of that. And then the funny thing about like cost plus contracts, it's actually like really good from an IRR perspective because you put in very little, relatively little money before you get money back out. But, the issue there is that they're really capped on their actual profitability, like how much net income they can generate or free cash flow they can generate. But the government often does cost plus contracts for these very ambitious technical projects that are going to take, indeterminate amount of time, could cost an indeterminate amount of money. Cost type contracts make a ton of sense for very ambitious technical efforts. But then there's kind of another model where you can think about using a firm fixed price contract, which transfers a lot of the risk to the contractor, transfers all the risk to the contractor. But if you're doing more incremental technology development, a firm fixed price contract can make more sense. A firm fixed price contract also incentivizes efficiency, because there's a possibility of keeping more profit. With a cost type contract, it incentivizes creating work for yourself because that's the only way you can grow your actual profitability. Whereas on an FFP, it incentivizes finding efficiencies. And then I think like these cost contracts like also come down to it's exactly what you're talking about with how many generations of a particular type of thing are we going to buy. So if we're only going to buy one generation every 40 years, and we need to make a significant technical leap forward to feel like we're prepared for a 40-year lifetime, that really pushes you towards a cost type contract because you're going to have some kind of speculative requirements in there. By the way, this is like where the Army has gone wrong with every attempt to replace the Bradley. They have come up with what I would consider somewhat sci-fi requirements. It's also where they went wrong with, FARA, the Future Attack Reconnaissance Aircraft. I think that's what the acronym stood for. So that was going to be this would be like the second or third attempt to replace the Apache, I think. But, they basically wanted it to fly so far, so fast, do so many different things. The GAO told them that what they wanted was physically impossible. So that's the kind of like world that you get into when you're trying to replace, the Apache rolled out in the early 80s.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas
still kicking, still being
still
utilized.
Kicking, exactly. Though who knows for how much longer? I know you said before we started we want to talk a little bit like about the future of war, and there's kind of some open questions about like rotary aviation, or at least crewed rotary aviation there. Whereas if you do with a firm fixed price contract with a whole bunch of different versions of a thing, then you can take on less technical risk in each increment. And my supposition would be that the government would actually get a better product over time, buying more incremental improvements and then recompeting things or managing fleets, like concurrent fleets. Like one of the cool things about the US military for being so large is that we have, 16 armored brigade combat teams between the active component and the National Guard. Mm-hmm. Like, that's enough ABCTs that we could manage two different types of tanks if the, acquisition and sustainment workforces on the government side wanted it. And if we had two competing tank programs that, had to demonstrate greater value in order to, end up with like a large proportion of that fleet, I think that would be very helpful, like very healthy. And it might even foster competition on the government side if you've got two different tank teams and competition on the industry side, because, you'd be refreshing these twice as often. And by the way, like we could totally do this from a money perspective if we moved some of the funds we were spending on research and development into procurement. So it's not like the money doesn't exist for this. It's that it's all going into, RDT&E, research development, testing and evaluation. And like, frankly, this is like kind of a bigger topic, but like those RDT&E dollars don't get a really good return typically. A lot of it is justified by the successes of DARPA in the past, but there's only one DARPA, and there's a lot of DoD labs that just kind of spin their wheels on science projects. So, there are all these programs that have been created over the years to attempt to solve that problem around like DoD labs, like FedTech is one where you say, all right, we're going to pair entrepreneurs with PIs from DoD labs, and we're going to find this great technology that just hasn't been fully utilized, and then we're going to commercialize it. Basically never happens. I can't think of a single success story that's like actually turned into like a major product, a really successful business off of that. And that's because like the incentives for the researchers in DoD labs are really misaligned with like producing anything useful to the warfighter. I'm not going to say they aren't producing anything of scientific utility, but in terms of like actual defense product that you're going to go put in a user's hands.
Yeah.
So it's a complicated market with a lot of problems.
Definitely. Well, I think we'll shift to some good news, perhaps, that especially Anduril has been a part of. I think earlier this spring, Anduril was one of 2 vendors selected to move forward on the Collaborative Combat Aircraft Program. That's big. And so like in the next phase of this, like Anduril with design, manufacturing, test, production, representative CCAs. Could you explain a little bit about the significance of this? Because this is a big win for Anduril to be at this stage. And I believe they're competing with one of the primes on this next stage of the program.
Yeah, so General Atomics is the other competitor at this stage. And I mean, General Atomics is a pretty successful defense company, but I would not put them in the same category as like the major primes. Yeah, I believe GA's flagship product is the Predator. So
Predator drone, for everyone.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple interesting things about the CCA award to Anduril. So I think one, it's a strong signal that Anduril is building an organization that can do more than these like small scale robots that have some sensor integrations, which is super exciting. Like, I mean, the CCA program is hundreds of millions of dollars, a multi-year design effort. It's a cost plus contract, which is a little different for us. But I think if the Air Force follows through, production will be firm fixed price, where we can realize some of the efficiencies that we talked about earlier. That'll make hopefully the economics very appealing to us. Mm-hmm. So I mean that's one thing. It's good news about Anduril, but I think the better news for the industry is that I think like a little bit more forward-looking acquisition strategy on the part of the Air Force. So they started with, in the previous phase there were 5 competitors. They scoped down to 2. The Air Force is saying that they want to continue to have multiple models of CCA. They have expressed to the folks that were not selected going into this phase that they can recompete for the next phase. I'll be very curious to see if that happens, because just like we were discussing, depending on the profitability you think you can realize in a production contract, it can be very difficult to justify investment in getting ready to compete for that. If you're, so like Anduril and GA are going to get hundreds of millions of dollars from the government to develop their prototypes. And I don't think, Lockheed or Kratos are going to find that amount of money. We ought to justify putting that amount of money into developing, their prototypes, just to recompete in the next phase, unfortunately.
Right. So it's like the 2 companies, General Atomics, pronouncing it right, and
GA,
GA and Anduril, essentially, because they're the finalists in this stage, they get reimbursed, or the government will fund their prototypes, their models to be evaluated for the final selection. And whereas these other 3, while they were competing for this stage, because they weren't selected, they could still compete in the next stage, but they would then have to put in their own resources without this necessary guarantee.
Right. And then, you think about like General Atomics and Anduril are both going to be working really closely with the program office over this entire prototype phase, or design phase. I don't work directly on CCA, so I might not have the terminology correct. But yes, I mean, it goes back to like the government's just going to know way more about our solutions, and they're probably going to feel way more confident in the teams that Anduril and GA have assembled. So, we're also like I think super happy that GA was the other selectee because they're another, smaller firm. They're not one of the mega
Biggest.
primes.
Right.
Right. And so there's, another aspect to this selection, which is that I think the Air Force is trying to send a signal to the primes that they can't assume that every contract is going to them. And, because like we talked about the sort of pernicious effects of market consolidation. I think we discussed that a little bit the first time
Right.
around. And so, you're never going to introduce more competition without more players. And in order to get more players, you have to award non-traditionals big contracts. So it does seem like the Air Force is putting their money where their mouth is, at least when it comes to uncrewed aviation. Actually, the Air Force is just like winning right now on buying airplanes because the B-21 program seems to be doing very well, and that's a Northrop effort. But like also, I think part of the success of B-21 is they're not taking a ton of technical risk. So, it is. I was reading some article about it the other day, and I think it's a similarly sized aircraft to the B-2 Spirit. Similar technology in terms of like signature reduction. I think it might actually have less payload capacity than the B-2. I think that might have been something the article said. Yeah, so you can still do these like advanced platform development efforts on schedule, on cost, but it needs to be incremental development and not, trying to revolutionize.
Right.
It's been a long time since we've been able to develop we, the U.S. defense industry, has been able to develop a revolutionary product quickly. If folks are interested in that, this book Skunk Works is like a classic. Talks about like the development of stealth, like the first stealth aircraft prototype that Skunk Works flew called Have Blue. They built in 18 months.
Wow.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know anybody in the industry who could build a major platform in 18 months.
That is incredible.
Admittedly, it was probably like held together with like duct tape and dreams, but the thing flew, and it was very, very low observable.
Right. Well, I guess like with that time frame, I think another big win that Anduril was a part of was Titan, I believe. Just actually pretty recently, it was in collaboration with Palantir. I read in the article, it was a 9-figure contract, but it was like Palantir had it and then brought on Anduril. But I think overall, the joint team delivered the prototype in like 4 or 5 months, which is that normal for kind of the developments of like a new prototype, or what is the normal timeline, and how do you think why Anduril and Palantir were able to like have that delivered in such a short time frame?
And I believe there are a few other folks on the team. Like the Titan team's pretty big. So, Palantir is the software lead. Anduril, I believe, is the hardware lead. So, I think like our ability to deliver that prototype quickly came back to this like technical risk question. So Titan is like a truck that's a command post. It's an air-conditioned box on the back of a truck. And every engineering vehicle development project has its own challenges, but that is a far simpler challenge than building a tank or a fighting vehicle or an aircraft. So I think it came down to like smart design decisions that took technical risk out of the project. I'm not sure if that's a firm fixed price or a cost plus contract, unclear to me. But I think that's a good example of how you can be fairly conservative on the hardware side while delivering really important capability improvements through software. Because I mean that's what's like really special about Titan is that it has really good Palantir software in it.
Absolutely.
So this gets back to the like software defined, hardware enabled piece that is so central to the the Anduril thesis. And the great thing about software too is that you can push improvements to it much easier than you can to hardware systems. So I think like we, the US military, will be in a much better place the more we are able to utilize software improvements versus hardware improvements. So I think like Titan is like moving in that direction, which is pretty exciting.
Definitely. Well, it's definitely a lot of great innovation in the software space. with Anduril itself, and you're based, we talked in the first episode, you're based in California, you're like nearish to Silicon Valley, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, we're like close enough that, you can recruit people from San Francisco. We'll say that.
Right. Well, I think, I think the area I'm trying to discuss is, innovation and defense has been this new kind of a new thing in the last few years, being based out of California and San Francisco. Prior to that, there was this general kind of, at least within the Silicon Valley frame, this aversion to working with the DoD. A lot of companies didn't necessarily feel like they wanted to, but now we've seen this change. Anduril, Palantir, and even Google has kind of focused more on a collaborative environment with the DoD. What are your thoughts on kind of that perception, or why that hasn't necessarily been? Because you would think, I think, DoD would want to foster innovation, but it hasn't been necessarily done so with some of the fastest growing, the most innovative companies that really shifted technology forward.
Yeah, so I think I'd like to take this on from two directions. So one, there's like why is the DoD challenged to work with Silicon Valley style startups, and then why have a bunch of startups and investors gotten interested in DoD recently?
Right.
So, I think that the challenge goes back to the profitability thing that I mentioned
Mm-hmm.
earlier and some of the barriers to entry. So like it's really hard to reach a good exit on an appealing timeline for a startup that's trying to build in defense. So defense companies are traditionally valued at, I don't know, like 2 to 3 times revenue,
Mm-hmm.
which is really low by commercial
Startup.
standards and
Yeah.
yeah, by startup standards. And so, this valuation gets, north of a few $100 million, it becomes really hard for a prime to buy them, no matter how compelling the technology is, just because there's like such a delta in the cost, like how expensive their revenue is. It becomes very dilutive for the prime. So that can be tough. It also like kind of the earnings profile of the prime. They are like prime's investors get into them because they're very low risk and they're very entrenched, and they're just going to provide, kind of a steady stream of dividends.
Yeah.
Whereas like a Silicon Valley company, you're like plowing a ton of money into IRAD, you're trying to dominate a market, and then hopefully, reap, semi-monopoly profit. I think like the important caveat for government people that might be listening here is that like that is an earned monopoly. That is not like, your standard oil and you're selling, a fungible commodity and you just like have the market cornered, and so you're like squeezing everybody. It is, you develop the best thing, and
Yeah.
so now
You
everybody
developed
wants to
market.
buy.
You might have
Right.
actually developed market like Uber has for that space, DoorDash, right? It wouldn't have existed without you.
Right. And so like, we talked a little bit about like it's hard to get acquired, and there's like, moats and all of this. And then the other question is like, what's at the end of the rainbow? You like develop your great product, you scale in defense. Like the end of the rainbow cannot be being valued at 2.5 times revenue and making, 8% net income and not growing very quickly because you're in some small niche inside defense. Those factors are just like not going to get you to a venture outcome. I think there's like tools the DoD has to solve that. So there's like FAR Part 12, which relates to buying commercial items. There is the the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, FASA, that's supposed to create commercial preference. And so like if you're buying commercial and you're preferring commercial, then like a lot of these issues around like profit margins and like complicated contract structures should be alleviated. My real kind of doomer sentiment right now is that a lot of the federal, like the DoD workforce, doesn't
Mm-hmm.
want to work on a commercial basis because it means they're just like less relevant. Like we built up this whole, like all these bureaucracies and tons of folks whose
Yeah.
careers are like pushing engineering documents related to cost plus development contracts around, DoD offices. And so if we started just like buying stuff, if we move from, DoD funded development efforts to like oh, we're going to ask a bunch of folks to bring their prototypes. We get rid of a lot of the R&D, and then it's all about testing and evaluation. And then potentially like people are profiteering when they're making like 25% on their, best in class drone or whatever.
Right.
So that's like on the obstacle side. And then on the like, why Silicon Valley like gotten very invested?
Mm-hmm.
I hate to say it, but I think like a lot of it is like naivete,
Mm-hmm.
and misreading the macro, which, I think are kind of related. So on the naivete side, I talked about before all these like defense innovation offices that the DoD has stood up. There's a lot of messaging around how they want innovative new entrants to come into the government. And so I think there was kind of like a lot of folks took that at face value that like the DoD was really serious because, you saw activity, you saw these offices, and suddenly there was like all these events that were focused on it. But there wasn't really an appreciation that kind of the market fundamentals hadn't changed. Like there's still bias against commerciality, growth is still really slow. All the stuff I talked about earlier in terms of like primes having very strong relationships with all the customers that matter, and kind of the difficulty in extricating them so that you can potentially win, a major program. And then like on the macro, so you had like there were international political developments, and then there were interest rates. And so kind of my like impressionistic timeline is 2015 to like 2020, the defense innovation wave, defense tech wave, was supported by government messaging. And so there was like folks that got in because they were saying, yes, the DoD is going to change, and if I invest early, I will be in a position, my portfolio companies or my company will be in a position to like catch the revenue when the DoD finally, starts actually like awarding production contracts to startups. I don't think that's actually happened. I'm pretty sure that the DoD is continuing to spend somewhere between $3 to $5 billion a year on venture-backed companies, and that's been pretty consistent for a long time. So the revenue hasn't materialized. Then like we had a couple different macro inflections around 2020, and so you had COVID, the interest rates came, we had like interest rates come up like the end of ZERP. And so then people were saying all the, SaaS is dead. What is, counter-cyclical or acyclical? And defense is defense is an acyclical business. Like, you always need to spend money on the military. I think maybe the subtlety there that people missed is that real defense spending typically declines when there's inflation, because the DoD doesn't really like structure a lot of contracts around inflation. And the reason they don't is because Congress isn't necessarily going to appropriate that. Like Congress is not necessarily going to like index the defense budget to inflation.
No, it'd be much higher if that was the case.
Right. So you end up getting like real defense budget declines when there's inflationary episodes. And then you also had, increasing geopolitical, I wouldn't say even increasing tensions, but more talk about tensions between the US and the PRC. And then you had, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think there's like macro factors that made people say, this is actually like a really good time to invest in defense. Then there's another kind of like interesting caveat in there, which is that, if you look at if you have these VCs that are effectively like betting on World War III, then like that's the bet.
A very cynical bet.
A very cynical bet. You actually don't want like war is actually terrible for defense industry profits. Like war is great for defense industry revenue because you're going to be getting all these orders and production's going to scale, blah 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 blah. But if you're making money during this like existential struggle for your country, right, that's war profiteering. So like if you look at the actual like profitability of major defense contractors during World War II, a lot of them were keeping like 1%.
Wow. Yeah.
So
I don't think people think about that. People just think about your billions of dollars in contracts to produce these things. And I mean, I'm sure some were accused of war profiteering or inefficiencies after the fact.
Yeah, I mean that was much more of a problem in World War One. So like a lot of the way like defense industrial policy got handled in World War Two was a reaction to what happened in World War One, where things were a little bit more laissez-faire, and you had a lot of like war millionaires, and that created a lot of consternation. So yeah, that's something people don't think about. Like the defense industry does best when there are tensions and everybody's very concerned about cutting edge technology and they want to
Yeah.
incentivize the best possible product. When the actual war happens, that's terrible.
Right.
So
I don't think
kind of
people, that's a very unique insight. I don't think people think about. Yeah, it's like you want the research, you want the profit margins, but then like if it actually goes too far, not a good
right.
choice.
And then you have like a whole bunch of risks in terms of like your factory can get bombed or
Yeah.
your employees can get drafted. There's like all these terrible things that happen when there's a war. So, and the funny thing is, like, I picked that up from this book called Destructive Creation, which I strongly recommend. Everybody always recommends Freedom's Forge, which I think is a good book, but I think it should be read in conjunction with Destructive Creation because he gets a little bit more into like, not just sort of this like hagiography of business leaders that were involved in the World War II mobilization, but also into like what happened with unions and like how did all of these factories get built. It was a lot of public money actually, like
Yeah.
the War Department fronted all the capex for the factories that produced the World War II mobilization. And so like by the end of the war, I can't remember exactly what the figure is, but like the US government owned like 80 or 90% of aircraft manufacturing facilities.
Wow.
And then they were operated by contractors on a cost plus basis. So you had these government owned contractor operated facilities that was super common. It was called GOCO. And then there was also government owned, government operated GOGO. And we do still have some of those too. So like the arsenals that make like artillery barrels are actually I think this might be GOCO these days. Anyway, I think like the examples of GOGO are like the US Navy shipyards to the extent that I think we have one or two of those left.
Yeah,
I wrote
I'm actually at the Brooklyn Navy shipyard right now where I work. So it's, it's still a federal facility, still operating.
nice.
Andrew, I know we're running up on time here, so I just want to say I know we've talked about so much, but last comment is like, please tell the audience what you're excited about. I mean, you've been at Anduril for a year now, several years post grad. What are you excited about, kind of with the industry? What are you looking forward to, perhaps in
Yeah,
the next few years?
what am I looking forward to? Yeah, so I think the government is going to realize the real potential of autonomy in the next couple of years. So if I'm gonna, feel bullish for a moment, I feel like I'm like a perma bear about a lot of stuff that goes on defense tech. But if I'm gonna feel bullish for a moment, I think the government's gonna realize that like autonomy and software are like the real deal. Like you can
Yeah.
really change the way you operate by integrating humans and machines.
Hmm.
And I think that's going to like open up a whole new vista of like opportunity because suddenly we're going to want to introduce robots that are carrying a lot of capabilities that are currently on crewed platforms. I think that the progress towards buying software in a way that incentivizes software companies, it's never as fast as we would like, but like I think especially if Anduril continues on the path that it's on, and crucially we're able to maintain more of our like working with the DoD on a commercial basis when we hit scale,
Hmm.
and the DoD sees the proof needs to be in the pudding that
Of course.
you can work with a company in a commercial way, then I think we do have a real chance to change the force composition towards more human machine integrated formation. We have an opportunity to see a whole lot more use of non-traditional acquisition tools, which will, hopefully actually like start to inject more competition into the DoD, and they'll start to see what they want, which is industry investing in capability. So yeah, I mean, I think there's like we're going to go through a winter, I think, pretty
Hmm.
soon. Like all
Mm.
the defense tech companies are going to run out of money, but
Mm.
what comes after winter is spring,
That's right.
and I think we will see a defense tech spring where everybody will learn some hard lessons and we'll be better off for it. hopefully in the 2030s, we will actually be talking about a vibrant defense tech ecosystem with revenue and profit and the kind of dynamism that we all hope for.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully we'll maybe eventually do a part three, but maybe not waiting until the 2030s at that point.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. But thank you, Andrew, so much again for your insights. And I think our audience has enjoyed our last episode, so I hope they'll enjoy this one.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a lot of fun. And yeah, hope we get to do this again sometime. You have a great rest of your day, William. All right.
Thank you, Andrew.